what the Israeli government says they want to do now is take control of Gaza, split it into three parts to keep the population there, well, some people would say like animals in enclosures, and feed them a minimum of food so that they don't die. Certainly the atmosphere outside, the British, the French, the Canadians and so on, they're also saying enough, enough. You have succeeded militarily, and any more than this is just cruelty.
Is there anybody actually working on a proper plan for how to end this for real?
Fundamentally, in the end, it comes down to the Americans, and it comes down to American support of Israel. Because if Israel loses American support, it can't survive.
Hello and welcome to The Forecast. I'm Krishnan Giri-Murthy. It's 600 days since Israel's war with Gaza began after the October 7th attacks by Hamas. And it's a moment to try and take stock because things seem to be shifting. There is more anger that we have been reporting on the ground in Israel around the Israeli government's position. The families of the hostages are demanding an end to the war and believe that carrying on makes it less likely that they will get their loved ones back. At the same time, Britain, France, Canada, and others are expressing deep concern about the blockade on aid and are saying that what Israel is doing is totally unacceptable. So things could be shifting a little bit. Let's take stock with where we are with our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, who has spent the last couple of weeks in Israel for us. Lindsay, does it feel like things are shifting?
It does feel that things are shifting, but I would say still just on the margins. So if you look at the government, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition, they are very clear that the war will continue. Another 300,000 reservists have been called up in the last week or so. Many of them have gone in. There's a new ground offensive. They are attacking from the air with the same ferocity as before. And we are seeing this horrendous situation of hunger in Gaza with only a tiny trickle of aid allowed through. Now, yes, I have spoken to some people who are against this. There's a small group of reservists, some of whom had fought in Gaza, who were in favor of the war at the beginning after the horrendous killings and rapes on October the 7th. But now they're saying, what are we doing? What are we achieving? And those people who are criticizing are saying that there is no military logic to continuing this war in this way. This is just to save Benjamin Netanyahu's political skin.
Now, is the military logic shifting as well? Because there are, again, louder voices on the right, it seems, and now within the government, talking more aggressively about what they want to do, which is to take over Gaza and to control it militarily fully.
Yeah, I mean, look, Hamas has been suppressed militarily. It is no longer firing missiles into Israel. Now, has it been crushed completely as an idea? No, it never will be crushed completely as an idea. But as a military force, it is tremendously weakened and all of its leadership have been killed. Now, what the Israeli government says they want to do now is take control of Gaza. And we've seen various, maps have come out, which basically indicate that they want to split it into three parts to keep the population there. Well, some people would say like animals in enclosures, and feed them a minimum of food so that they don't die. And that's it. It's not viable. It's not any kind of way that anybody would want to live. And what some are saying on the far right is that the aim of this is to force them to leave, or as they put it, to leave voluntarily. They will want to leave if the conditions are like this. And so those who oppose this would say this is ethnic cleansing. And you were talking about a former prime minister, I think, as Ehud Olmert. He has now come out and said what is being done now, these are war crimes. And certainly the atmosphere outside, the British, the French, the Canadians and so on, they are also saying enough. Enough. You have succeeded militarily, and any more than this is just cruelty.
Are the far-right war aims now effectively adopted by Netanyahu and the government?
Yeah, look, they keep his coalition going. There's two particular far-right ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezos Smotrich, and their people. If they drop out of the coalition, then his government falls. If Benjamin Netanyahu's government falls, then this long-standing corruption case, which he has to appear in court for several times a week, that will go further. And it looks as if he may not win a new election. And so that is what he doesn't want to do. That is what he fears more than anything else, facing a new election. And so he's really at their mercy and whatever they want to do. And these are people who were on the absolute margins of Israeli society before. People who believe that Palestinians basically should be wiped off the state of what they call Eretz Israel, Greater Israel. They don't mince their words about it. But this is now in the mainstream of government.
And so where are the talks going, if anywhere at all? I mean, we have Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, talking about a ceasefire plan which would involve getting half of the hostages, live and dead, back in return for another temporary ceasefire. Given what we've seen over the last few weeks of Israel's onslaught on Gaza, why would Hamas go for that, knowing that Israel will just start again?
Well, I'm not sure that either Hamas or Israel is going for that. Benjamin Netanyahu withdrew his envoys to the talks the other day. But there's a really critical thing here, which is that the Americans had a separate negotiation with Hamas to get the last American Israeli hostage out, a man called Idan Alexander. And he came out a couple of weeks ago. Now, that shows that by negotiating, the Israeli government could get their hostages out. And there are 58 there, of which 20 are believed to be still alive. And there are many demonstrations today here in Tel Aviv, where I am, from the hostage families and supporters of the hostage families saying, look, this continued war is endangering the lives of our family members. And we know because the Americans did it. You can negotiate to get these people out. Do that now. And they are blaming the Israeli government, as they see it, for condemning their family members, hostages, to starvation and to possible death.
But are they right to think that they can get their family members out at this stage, given Israel's stated aim now is to take over the full Gaza Strip? I mean, what is the logic in why this would go anywhere, given Israel still wants to crush Hamas and continue bombing?
That's a good question. And there is an argument which says that, the hostages are the only bargaining chip that Hamas has. But there's a diminishing return because it is very hard under these circumstances for Hamas to keep these people alive, these poor people who are suffering, along with the Gazans who are suffering too. And hostages have a lot more value as bargaining chips, to put it bluntly, if they're alive than if they're dead. And certainly Hamas wants to be seen to be part of negotiations. That, I think, is what they proved with these negotiations with the Americans. That, in a sense, puts them in the Americans' good books, as it were, compared to Israel. And at the moment, even the Americans are beginning to lose patience with Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump himself has said, look, I don't want to see all this starvation in Gaza. I don't want to see all this suffering. And so I think that it's not just the Europeans who are beginning to lose patience with the Israeli government. It's also the Americans. And of course, the Americans are the ones who hold the key. Because if they cut off military aid, that's the end of it. Then the Israeli government absolutely has to back down. No, we're nowhere near there. But, President Trump, he's not a traditional politician. If he totally loses patience, he might just do that. You just don't know.
It is the situation on the ground in Gaza which has provoked these angry words, if you like, from Europe and Canada, and as you say, might be moving the situation in America to over aid and the blockade that has gone on for 11, 12 weeks. Now, this is like a tap that Israel can turn on and off, and we've started to see a little bit more aid going in today, but the situation is still, really desperate. And, there are images of starving children and all the knock-on effects of lack of food in terms of the general health of the population. What is the actual situation now in terms of how aid is getting in, who's distributing it? How are people getting it?
Look, it's absolutely horrendous. And people are desperately hungry. And we've seen images of women and their children scrabbling in the garbage, trying to find just a few scraps to eat. And once aid stops like this, it takes a time before there's enough going in. People die in the gap. And what is happening now is that a tiny amount is going through. They need 500-600 trucks a day. And at the moment, they're lucky to get, not even 100. I think none are going in today. And the Israelis have decided that the well-worn system of the UN distributing aid, which on the whole is not looted by Hamas. In fact, Hamas are the people who frequently stop the looting because they put guards on the trucks, because otherwise people are so desperate they send out the young men in the family just to get whatever they can. But the Israelis and the Americans have started this new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is supposed to be doing aid. It has no experience in doing aid. It knows nothing about it. They are security people. They have developed a system which was of biometric, facial recognition and so on. They started yesterday. And what is the result? Riots, desperation. And then they start shooting. And lots of people were injured. It was complete chaos. But they will not let the UN, which does know what it's doing, distribute the food. So what is the result of that? The result is more hungry children and probably more dead children.
And do we know who they really are? I mean, Yair Lapid, the Israeli opposition leader, has questioned whether they are effectively being run by Israel, even though they are an American organization, an American charity. I mean, do we really know how this is being run?
Look, it's murky. It's extremely murky. We don't know the funding. We do know that the idea was conceived by the Israeli government. And we do know that people from American security forces are running it. And we do also know that the person who was leading it has resigned because he said it could not abide by international humanitarian standards of neutrality and effectiveness. So clearly it is not being run by people who know what they're doing. And so it does appear that the aim is not so much to actually relieve the situation, but to allow, as Benjamin Netanyahu puts it, a minimal amount of aid in, but also to increase social control. The Israelis are trying to keep a certain distance from it, but I'm not sure how convincing that is.
The Palestinians say around 60 people have died of starvation so far, on top of all the people being killed in the bombing. Now, these are numbers, as you know, that the Israelis tend to sort of poo-poo and say, well, you can't trust anything that's coming out of Hamas. I mean, how do you deal with that kind of information when you're in Israel and sort of assess it and try and work out what you can say and what you can't?
It's extremely difficult to assess information from Gaza because, as you know, international journalists have not been allowed in by either the Egyptian or the Israeli authorities since October the 7th. We have an excellent team of Gazan journalists who work for us, and the information they provide is reliable. But of course, they can't go around adding up the numbers of people who are killed and who are starving. And in any situation, those numbers are extremely difficult because quite often, kids don't die of starvation. They have malnutrition and then they die of something else. They die of pneumonia. They die of respiratory diseases. Many years ago, before I was a journalist, I was an aid worker in Ethiopia during the famine there in 1984 and 85. And I can remember this. It was really hard to know those numbers because kids died quietly and were buried by their families. It's not always possible to know what the exact numbers are. But what we do know from the eyewitnesses we have there and the pictures which are coming out is there is the most appalling and unbelievable suffering going on. We had a story the other day of a little girl and we could see her in the flames of the house which had just been hit by an Israeli airstrike. And then we saw her later sitting in the charred ruins crying about the fact that her brothers and sisters and her mother had been killed. And if you don't look at that and cry, then you have a heart of stone. And some of the right-wing Israelis I've spoken to say they don't care because this is a battle between good and evil. And the Israelis are good and the Arabs are evil, and that the Palestinian children, they want to kill our children, they say. Well, it's one way of looking at the world. But most people, and I would say most Israelis, do not look at the world like that. Most people do have a heart and do understand that this deliberate starving of children and continued attacks, which, yes, may get Hamas members, but which also get huge numbers of civilians, it has to stop.
Yes, I mean, that story of Wad, the little girl, has obviously gone right around the world and has affected a huge number of people. But you can also see the backlash online from the Israeli right and on social media who are trying to undermine it and say that this is all fake. They talk about a thing called Pallywood, as if all the children who are filmed or the civilians full stop who are filmed are sort of making it up. Again, could you just explain, how you get that material, who does it, how do you assess it, how do you know it's true?
Well, as I say, we have a team on the ground, and they film, and then we talk to them. We talk to them about how did you get that material, and how did you know that person, and where did the information come from, and so on. And it's quite painstaking stuff. But also, it's not like we're the only people. There are also, the news agencies, Reuters and the Associated Press, they have their teams there, and quite often the information overlaps. So you are sort of getting more than one source. And the BBC has people there on the ground. Most of the larger news organizations do have people on the ground who are filming and getting information. And most of these stories do back each other up. But also, a couple of days ago, I spoke to a young man who had been a reservist who was serving in the military in Gaza. He did 2 tours, 270 days. Now, he had initially, on October the 7th, rushed down to do what he could. He was horrified by the Hamas killing of his people, and then he believed totally in going in and fighting Hamas. But he did say, look, this level of destruction and death of Gazans is not all right. It's a stain on Israel, on Israel's conscience. He said that the most of the damage that he saw was done by airstrikes. That was most of the killing. But he also said that the soldiers on the ground, and he was with a unit on the ground, he's a deputy commander of a unit, he said there was no accountability. That if you saw, and this is always a problem in guerrilla warfare, I understand that you see somebody and you shoot them, and then you discover that they were a civilian. Now, that is difficult if you're fighting a militant or terrorist organizations. They don't wear uniforms, they hide their weapons and so on. You're not quite sure who you're seeing. But the point he was making was that there was no accountability, that the rules of engagement were basically, he said, the Wild West. In other words, you shoot whoever you want to shoot, because the only thing that matters is protecting your life. It's force protection. So there was him. And then there's a former spokesperson of the Israeli Defense Force, Colonel Peter Lerner, who I also know. He's now retired. He wrote an article the other day, and he said, we cannot deny that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. He said, look, you just can't deny it. It is happening. So it's not just the international media working with their local journalists who are saying this. There are some Israelis, including those who have been there, who are also saying this, as well as some of the politicians on the centre and the left.
So can we talk then about where this is going? I mean, there is no particular reason why 600 days should be, a moment of change, but it's a moment to take stock, I suppose, and work out, where this might move. Apart from the sort of the attempts to bring back another temporary ceasefire, which we've discussed, is there anybody actually working on a proper plan for how to end this for real?
The Saudis and other Gulf countries, and working with the French, are talking about a plan for the day after. And there's going to be a conference which will be organised by Saudi Arabia and by President Macron of France, which is coming up in the next few weeks. And I suspect that they're going to talk about a day after plan. The Israelis do not have a day after plan, apart from their plan, which is just to corral everybody and feed them the minimal amount so that they don't all die of starvation immediately. The Israelis do not seem to have a viable plan. But I think that the other thing which is interesting is that the impact this is having on Israel. They have called up another 300,000 reservists. This is a country of less than 10 million people. Already the economy has suffered. 75,000 small businesses have closed down, partly because the economy just has generally suffered and partly because the people who are running those businesses are fighting. People working in the high-tech sector here, they don't want to live in this country if it's going to be a never-ending war. And many of them have alternative passports. And so they have left, many of them going to America. And then you have this political crisis, this permanent political crisis, because Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition is so dependent on the far right. And then you have all this diplomatic pressure on the government as well. So Israeli society is under a lot of strain. And I think that we are going to see in the coming months and days is going to have an impact too. And then from the point of view of the West Bank, you increasingly see the far-right settlers attacking Palestinians in their villages, taking over more and more land, and nothing being done to stop them because basically the Israeli government supports them. So this is like a new front in the war that is opening up. You still have Yemen, the Houthis occasionally firing here. They fired at the airport the other day. And yesterday, the Israelis fired into Yemen. And they hit airport there. They say they destroyed the Houthis' last aircraft. And then you have a split between the Americans and the Israelis about Iran, because President Donald Trump, he wants to talk to Iran and to have a negotiation about their nuclear program. But then you have the Israelis who want to bomb Iran. Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to think that bombing is the answer to many of their problems, whereas President Trump seems to be moving against that kind of idea. So you have all of these different fronts on which Israel is fighting and increasing pressure on them to do things differently from the Europeans and to some extent the Americans. So I think that there is a crisis brewing in Israel as well. And at the same time, we have this horrendous humanitarian situation in Gaza, unbelievable suffering. And until there is a change of policy, we are not going to see an end of that.
I spoke to a very senior European diplomat recently, just ahead of their talks with Israel. And they said to me, the Israelis don't care what we say. They tell us you should just be more like the Americans. And as long as they've got American support, it almost doesn't matter what we say. We try and say things as strongly as we possibly can, but we don't have purchase. That was somebody very senior in the European Union. Is it still the case that America is really the only player that can change things here?
Yes, I think in the end, America is the only player. But I mean, the Europeans do actually have some economic sway. Israel's biggest trading partner is the European Union, and the European Union could. They're reviewing their new trade deal. They could stop it. Britain has a policy which is contradictory. So on the one hand, they said they're suspending the trade talks for a new free trade deal with Israel. And then they send out a trade envoy, Ian Austin, who goes around Tel Aviv saying how marvelous the relationship with Israel is and how all these fantastic new deals that they're going to do. The British policy makes no sense. And as long as it makes no sense and has no coherence, then they're not putting any pressure on Israel at all. Now, if the European Union and Britain actually started to do things which would affect the economy, then that might have some impact. But yes, fundamentally, in the end, it comes down to the Americans and it comes down to American support of Israel. Because if Israel loses American support, it can't survive. And so that is what you have to look to in the coming weeks, whether President Trump, who incidentally doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu that much, they have fallen out over time. If President Trump, in his mercurial way, decides, actually, I don't like what I'm seeing, that would have the most impact.
But as you come to the end of this particular visit, do you see any grounds for hope in the near future? Or does this still feel like it's going to go on a long time?
I went to film at a left-wing anti-war rally the other day, and there were all the slogans that you would expect. And increasingly, people were holding up not just pictures of the hostages, but also Palestinian children. These were the people who were beginning to really think about the impact on Palestinian children. And there was one guy who had a poster and it said, "In Trump we trust." Now, that is not a poster you would expect to find at a left-wing rally. But what he said is, we're pinning our hopes on him. Because although we know that he supports the Israeli government, he has said he doesn't like what he's seeing. He doesn't like this war, and he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wants to be seen as the man who comes in and puts an end to conflict here. And also, as we know, he snubbed Israel on his last tour, and the places he really loves in the Middle East are the Gulf states, the really rich ones, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the places that he visited on this trip. And he's looking at this and beginning to think, well, where is the value for me in the support of Israel? And it seems as if he's looking and thinking, well, in the Middle East, the main value, and he does do value in monetary terms, is those Gulf states. And those Gulf states are not happy with what Israel is doing. So I think that the situation of, which we have taken for granted for so many years, of permanent, almost unquestioning American support for Israel, I don't know if that will continue without any questioning forever and ever. There may come a point where that changes, and it may be that it comes from an unexpected quarter, President Trump.
Lindsay, brilliant to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
Lovely to talk to you, Krish.
Well, that's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.